really the important thing, the reframing that I've done there is that when I feel really uncomfortable, like I'm like, oh man, I'm way in over my head. I don't know what's going on. I feel really lost and anxious. What I realized is those are the moments when I'm learning. So the minute that I start to feel uncomfortable or I start to feel overwhelmed, immediately my brain snaps to, oh, we are about to learn a lot really fast. And so being able to reframe that as a good experience rather than a bad one, I think is really important.
For our third tech track, I'm talking to Rachel today, who is the CEO and founder of Geosite, which is a venture-backed startup building tools to manage geospatial data such as satellite, drone, and IoT data. Rachel is also an instructor at Stanford University, where she teaches about technology and national security. Rachel received her bachelor's and master's degree in mechanical engineering from Stanford, where she's also currently in the PhD program. Rachel received the Forbes 30 Under 30 Award, is a DFJ Entrepreneurial Fellow, and is a mom of 2 kids. So can you tell us about Stanford undergrad and why that was unique?
Yeah, so I arrived at Stanford with a 8-week-old. I was basically the second undergrad that they had arrive at campus, second undergrad ever, arrive at campus with a kid. So that was a very unique experience. I was a very young mother. My ex-husband, he was in the military, so he wasn't here either. It was really just me and my daughter. And so it meant that, I didn't have a lot of the normal undergrad experiences. I had very different experiences than many of my peers, which Tulsi can tell you totally worked out for our crew because it meant that we had, our own digs and a little baby to play with, which was, really fun. And I found it to be really sobering. I think when you're in undergrad, it's easy to get really wrapped up by like grades or other, metrics that you've always used to measure yourself. And basically from the very start, I had a perspective where I was able to step back and be like, okay, school really matters, but there are other things that matter. So it goes back to that balance thing. I was able to maintain that from the start. And I had to learn how to ask for help. Right. So whether it was calling, a family member and saying, hey, I have finals coming up. I'm going to be really busy. I need extra support. Can you please come out and support me? And being able to kind of ask for what I needed very early and identify when I needed help, I think was extremely valuable. Although I wasn't as good at it in the beginning. I remember I was standing with 2 of the professors in the mechanical engineering department, and one of them was like, oh, did you see Rachel's capstone project? Was kind of bragging about it to this other professor as we stood there, and he was like, yeah, I can't believe she did all of that and is raising a kid. And this other professor turned to me and he was like, I didn't know that you had a kid. And I was like, well, yeah, it was never relevant. And he was like, well, you never asked for an extension, you never asked for help, you never needed any of these things. And I'm like, well, sometimes I need help, sometimes I don't. And it was really empowering to me to be able to say, okay, I have this unique circumstance and I am able to set the boundaries about when I ask for help and when I don't, and who gets to know things about what's in my personal life and who doesn't, and all of that. I think that was valuable.
And one of the things that's clear about your story is how deep of an attachment you have to Stanford and the people there in particular, because when we talk about Geosite, it'll become clear to people watching that Geosite really came out of the relationships that you developed at Stanford and the ideas that you had there. And you obviously had a pretty close relationship with your advisor. So what advice do you have to students in terms of making relationships and making the most of opportunities at a place like Stanford?
Yeah, I think one of the mindsets that I got, and I don't think it was early in undergrad, it was probably late undergrad, maybe into my master's when I really learned this, was when you feel that slight prickle that you feel intimidated by somebody, that's usually when I'm like, ooh, I want that person around me. So that was one piece of it. Was there were incredible people doing lots of different things, but when I found somebody that was like far better than I was at something that I wished I could be good at, or even somebody who was like really good at something that I knew I would never be good at. I just found that so deeply impressive. Those were the people I tended to stay really close with, right? Are these people that now I look at them and they're off in all their careers, and they're like, one of my classmates ran for Congress. I like, that still blows my mind. It's like they've gone off and done such different extraordinary things. And so I think forming those relationships is really important. I also wasn't necessarily very extroverted until late in undergrad. I think throughout, my early education, I was kind of an anomaly in most of my schools. And so it wasn't like I had a large group of friends who had the same outlook on education that I did. And so getting to Stanford, that took a little bit of learning that, like, oh, the people here care about learning as much as I do. And to really come out of my shell probably took a couple years. But then after that, yeah, it's like just being genuine with people about what you're curious about and what you know and don't know and what you hope to learn gets you really, really far.
At the end of your time at undergrad at Stanford, mechanical engineer, how do you think about the landscape now? Do you go out and get a job as a mechanical engineer, or do you do a master's, which is what you picked? How did you think about that?
So at the end of undergrad, so I've never been a good standardized test taker. So we'll start there. And to do the master's program, you have to take the GRE. And I did fairly poorly on the GRE. Because again, I don't do well with structured problem solving. I do well with like a ton of chaos, which is why I realized entrepreneurship, right? Later on, I was like, oh, entrepreneurship, peak chaos. I will do well here. Or like not just chaos, but ambiguity, right? And these tests really test for like specific kinds of reasoning, specific kinds of skills. And so I, took the GRE, didn't do well, took it again, did slightly better, but still not great, like 75th percentile, right? Which is not good enough for a Stanford master's program most of the time. And so I was like, well, I'll apply. If I get in, I'll do it. If I don't, here are the other things that I'll consider. And, I knew that my application was weak because of that, but I went to my advisors and said, hey, how much this was specifically to do the manufacturing track within mechanical engineering. So I went to my professors and I said, hey, how much I love this field. And how passionate about it I am. Would you mind writing me a letter of recommendation, right? And so I beefed up my application with that to see if like they let me squeak by with my bad scores. And they did, right? And so my deal with myself had been, if I get in, I'll do it.
Can we talk now about the genesis of Geosite and how that's intimately tied with the PhD program at Stanford that you were part of, or you still are part of? So how did you make the decision to do the PhD program, and who did you meet, or what were the relationships you developed in that program?
Yeah, so I guess this gets back to like just kind of a broader piece of advice is, you should always be looking for opportunities that don't fit the mold of the path that you thought you would be on. So my company really arose out of a bunch of separate opportunities that I had said yes to, not necessarily knowing where they would go or what the plan was, just knowing it was something I was interested in and that I would be able to execute at a really high level, right? So the first was, I was married to somebody in the military for a very long time, and I had grown up working on military bases, like going to military bases with my mother. And so I had a really good ability to communicate with people about national security. And so this was like kind of this weird other random skill that I had. I like to describe people as like puzzle pieces. Like you have kind of your core competencies and there's probably some gaps in there, but then you have these weird other little blobs kind of like stuck on the side. That like weird other blob that was stuck on the side was the fact that I could really easily communicate with people in the military or in national security in their own language, right?
Yeah, and
So
I'll just mention that I think that is really unique. I mean, for people who aren't
yeah,
in the Bay Area or at Stanford, the fact that you had that skill and a very deep skill, that's something that most Stanford people don't know anything about. So yeah,
yeah,
I just wanted to mention that.
totally. And I would say another one that like has to do probably with where I grew up. New Mexico is very, very much a meritocracy, and feeling intimidated by other people because of their position or rank was not something I was ever taught. So I also could walk into a room and there be multiple generals there and me be like, no, 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 that's not how machine learning works. Does somebody have a whiteboard? Let me just teach you guys real quick couple things about this and why you don't have the training data. You can't just like magically do things, right? And so I knew enough about a bunch of different fields of engineering to be like dangerous. And then I'd have to like call one of my friends after and be like, is that actually how machine learning works? Yeah. Okay, cool. Got that one right. Or ping them back and be like, actually, let me connect you to this expert who will correct all the things that I just said. But I could go like, so that's the other piece, right? Like, so not only could I communicate with them in third language, which is just people here in the Bay Area don't know how to do that. And actually that has extended into, my company went through Y Combinator. I started the like Y Combinator Slack channel for companies that are trying to work in defense, because now I try to mentor any YC companies who are trying to work with the military and are finding it to just be a black box and they have no idea where to start, because it can be very intimidating. So between those two superpowers, basically, I became known as the nerd that they could put in the room and they would translate, right? So if, a special operations command, set of personnel was coming to Stanford, or like, if a delegation was coming, or even like a Senate delegation, or even, an Army delegation or whatever was coming to Stanford to learn about new technologies, and then they had, computer scientists or aerospace engineers or whatever, they would put me in the room basically as the translator. And, this wasn't a structured choice. It wasn't like, oh, this is going to lead to a career for me. It was just interesting, right? And it meant that I got to learn a lot about what was happening in national security. It meant that I got to learn a lot about what was happening in different technical fields that I hadn't actually touched. And from that arose a couple of opportunities. One that, ultimately led to my PhD, one that ultimately led to my company. And so the first is they put together for each new administration, it sounds like something like a villain would have from like a movie. They call it their strategic master plan. And basically, which like cracks me up. I'm like, oh, I, wrote a portion of the strategic master plan. So one segment of this in the space chapter was a section on this ultra low cost access to space, right? Which of course we've all, really excitingly watched, Crew Dragon go up this summer. That stuff is very flashy, but the stuff that's happening in the background is actually also really exciting. Launching satellites is far cheaper than it's ever been. And so there's multiple things here. The first is that if you have so many different commercial companies creating and launching satellites, one of the things back to my love of manufacturing that I pointed out was like, there's no manufacturing standards around the like buses that go on these satellites. And that's a huge security concern. And so there were recommendations in there about that. There were recommendations about, data standards. There were recommendations around, here is how we do counterterrorism, right? Like, what do you do when the cost to launch a satellite is within the budget of an organization like Al-Qaeda, right? Like, those are hard questions. So there were, quite a few recommendations there. And then one of them was, there's this proliferation of data, but there's also far more users that want direct access to that data. And the plumbing doesn't exist, right? Which of course is partially caused by some of these other problems like lack of data standards, which makes it hard to fuse data. But then also the software is missing. There aren't very many interfaces for non-technical users to access spatially relevant data. So it was like, hey, if you're trying to close this feedback loop between images being taken in space, communication of IoT sensors on the ground through space platforms, that data isn't going into any sort of useful systems. And so that's slowing things down.
And I think what's really amazing about like the genesis of both the PhD and Geosite is that you were at the intersection, like you mentioned, of computer science, design thinking, mechanical engineering, aero-astro, and this knowledge that you already had about the military, right? So you were such a unicorn of being right in the middle and knowing enough about all these different fields to be dangerous and offer ideas and translate between them. And I'll connect it back to, like, I teach programming, basically in particular Android programming. So a lot of people watching are probably Android developers. And so what I always tell people is exactly kind of the journey that you're living out, which is that being a vanilla Android developer probably isn't enough if you want to have tremendous impact on the world. If you want to have outsized impact on the world, it's not enough to just do Android. You have to do Android with like low-powered devices, Android with IoT, or Android with something else to make you sit at the intersection where very few people are. And that's exactly, it sounds like what you did.
Yeah. And I think we actually had at some point one of the professors in the design program, because as a product designer, there's so many things you can go do that there aren't really well-defined paths. So they actually were very deliberate about helping us learn how to find our niche. And like, really it's about sitting down and saying, what are the things that I either have access to or have knowledge about or am like so crazy passionate about that nobody can out passion me on this because like I love it so much, right? Like, what are the things that you have in your toolkit, and then just like lean into them, right? And also a big piece of this is being willing to be in over your head, right? So even though I don't get easily intimidated, even though, I spoke both these languages, walking into a room where, I'm 30 or 40 years younger than everyone else there, or, there was a time when I was embedded with a special operations unit for a little bit, like I was clearly in over my head, right? Like absolutely in over my head and felt very uncomfortable a few times. And like really the important thing, the reframing that I've done there is that when I feel really uncomfortable, like I'm like, oh man, I'm way in over my head, I don't know what's going on, I feel really lost and anxious, what I realized is those are the moments when I'm learning. So the minute that I start to feel uncomfortable or I start to feel overwhelmed, immediately my brain snaps to, oh, we are about to learn a lot really fast. And so being able to reframe that as a good experience rather than a bad one, I think is really important. And being willing to be like, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to try this and it's going to be crazy and I'll learn something.
That sounds like you have really supportive investors who you're really happy with right now. Can you talk more broadly about the fundraising experience and what was it like to talk to all of these venture capitals? And especially going back to what we talked about earlier, I think Silicon Valley in general is very averse to kind of structure and bureaucracy and the military in general, right? So how did that work out?
Yeah, so our first two main customer groups were the military and oil and gas. So, in both cases, we were helping increase safety of remote operations. So to us, it's like, yes, these are our customer base. Like these are possibly controversial customers, but we're keeping people safe. We're increasing efficiency. Like we know we're solving a part of this problem that we care about. But we definitely had an investor say, to one of our investors, as they were trying to syndicate to them, oh, aren't they that company that works with the military and oil and gas? Yeah, we're not interested. And I was like, that's a very naive view of the world. Like you feel very safe here in the US because we have such a great national security apparatus, which of course there's always room for improvement. And people within national security are the first to like lay out all the issues. But to just have a blanket stance of like, I won't support the military, to me, it just doesn't work, right? Because the better tools they have, the fewer mistakes there are, the safer it is, the more accurate we can be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we would run into that periodically, but not as often. The The harder part of fundraising is nobody tells you how many investors you have to talk to. Like, I think the average for a seed round is 60 different VC firms. So that's a lot of meetings. Like, if you are trying to do it, and like, it's not like you meet with each of them once. On average, I would say I met with each one 2 or 3 times. I think I only made it up to 45 VCs, and then I was like, I'm done. And we actually didn't reach our goal for our seed round because we were just done. And also we had just gotten a 7-figure contract from a customer. So we were like, we also don't need to raise anymore. So we're done. And they were all like, wait, you're done? We were like, yeah, we're done. We're done. We're not taking any more meetings. And that was a really nice feeling. But I used to always wonder how politicians can repeat themselves over and over and over and over. Fundraising was that. Because every new person you hop on the phone with is like, so tell me your story. You're like, okay. And you just like flip it on, right? Yeah.
I want to acknowledge, Rachel, that when you walk in and you give your pitch, you are very unique. So I'm talking about your PhD candidate at Stanford. You are a single founder. And then I think the other big things I do want to call out is that you're a female founder. 3%, we were talking earlier, 3% of venture funding goes into female founders, which is such a tiny amount compared to what it should be.
Well, so female, let me correct that, 3% to female CEOs.
Female
so
CEOs,
if you expand it out to co-ed teams where there's a male CEO and a female co-founder, the number is larger. But female CEOs, yeah, it's 3%.
Yeah, and then on top of that, you're a mom of 2 kids. And so I just want to mention that. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how did that weigh on you mentally? Because I think for you care about the product. You think of yourself as a founder. But when people look at you, it's like, Rachel, she's so kind of unique. She's a unicorn. Like, she has all these things going on about her. So how do you deal with that?
I'm really good at focusing. So I remember once I thought, do you know what would be interesting is writing down like a timeline of all the things that have happened in the last 10 years. And I started to write down the timeline of like, having my first kid, having my second kid, having a spouse get deployed, right? Traveling abroad, starting a company, doing these research, like all of this stuff that has happened since basically a decade. Oh my gosh, I can't believe how old we are now. Over the last decade. And as I was looking at it, I started to feel overwhelmed, right? It's like, I'm still human. I am capable of being overwhelmed, right? And so like, I was looking at it and like starting to like draw everything out because I was just curious. And I stopped and I was like, I really don't need to look at all of this at once. It's about being able to focus. So like I said, Monday through Friday, I am hyper focused on my company. Fridays, I work on my PhD or here or there if I need to, because by Fridays, things are winding down with the rest of the team. They've like gotten what they need and, whatever. And then on the weekends, I just focus on family and on, my health and things like that. And so it's about being able to like just focus down to like, here's the thing I'm doing right now. Here's what matters. And so I think it's actually very rare that I sit down and think of like, oh my gosh, I'm ready. I don't sit down and like list out my resume to myself. I just work on one thing at a time and stay focused. And I think one thing I want to mention too is this is a more recent skill. And this happened because I was working with a military unit that had events that had happened that I was not like mentally prepared to deal with. And we were talking through things and I realized like, we can talk about the problems, we can talk about the technology, but I don't need to know everything all the time. So I am really, really careful about protecting my own mental health so that I can stay focused.
So as we wrap up, what wisdom do you want to share? So
my parting advice is to work on really big problems, really big, really complex, possibly even, seemingly unsolvable problems. Because those are the ones that really end up making your days feel worthwhile and end up feeling fulfilling even when you're like totally in the grind and working insane hours. That's my parting advice, is make sure you're working on problems that you care about.
And there's no shortage of huge problems. So I feel like that is such good advice.
Yeah, every time I see something really insane in the world, I always take a step back and I'm like, well, I will never be bored. Like, there are so many things that need to be fixed. So we will always have problems to solve.
I'm so grateful, Rachel, that, we met through my wife, Dulcie, at Stanford, and we were able to have this time together where you shared your journey. If people want to be able to follow along as you grow and as Geosite grows, or maybe even have the chance to kind of connect with you, how could they do that?
Yeah, the best way, although I'm pretty terrible about social media, is my Twitter. So I do have a Twitter. It's just @_Rachel Oldie, like my name.
Okay, perfect. I will leave a link to your Twitter in the description so everyone can go follow you. I really appreciate the time, Rachel. Thanks so much. It's been really helpful.
Thank you, Rahul.